Sometimes you just know which projects to build next. It's fair to say that we really needed some side tables. So here's what I came up with. I took the design cues from a TV cabinet that I'd already built, but first of all I really needed some sheet material that was 30mm thick. Now, I don't know whether it's to do with coronavirus, but my local shops have got a terrible selection of sheet goods at the moment. So I had to go with 18mm of MDF and 12mm of ply. So here's how I did it. I'm calling it PlyDF or MD Ply. Haven't decided yet. So here's what you're going to need. Some Easy Bond D-free cross-linking PVA filtered glue. It just means it's really runny and dries a bit slower than normal PVA. A few other bits, and also don't forget some lubricant. A higher percentage of alcohol will affect the finish though. If you've got a vacuum press, they really are great for this kind of thing. All of the techniques, materials, tools, etc. it's all in the description if you want to check it out. But basically, you can use a vacuum press just to laminate materials together to create your own. You can also use it for creating full shaker doors, that kind of thing. So they're really useful bits of kit. The white panel that you can see inside the bag is just a flat piece of melamine. I've cut a grid pattern in it which allows the air to be sucked out evenly, and also it just makes a nice flat surface for using. When you're using a vacuum press, just make sure you stack your components up in a pyramid fashion. Any edges that are overhanging the component below it will just simply get snapped off in the press. There you go, so that was pretty straightforward. So let's take a look at the design of these side tables. It starts off as a simple table with butt joints. Then we add a hardwood face frame with mitered corners, some veneer to the outside to give an impression that the mitre goes all the way through, some hardwood drawers, and I think that'll look good. First step was to cut the PlyDF down to size. Okay, I'll stop using that silly term now. In terms of the joinery for this, after a quick sanding, it was just simple dominoes. Then I had some nice veneers arrive from the wood veneer hub. So these are smoked eucalyptus and walnut, and when they first arrive you want to tape up the edges. They're really prone to cracking, and if you don't tape them up straight away the cracks can start to go all the way down through the middle. You want to spend a little bit of time trying to work out how to get the best yield out of your veneers. You might want to slip match them, book match them, or random match. If you've got a decent track saw, you can normally cut through your stack of veneers in one go. I find that when I break it down to size with a track saw, usually I can get a good enough edge straight off the blade to start joining the veneers together. If you try veneering out for the first time, you'll discover quite quickly that it's just not that hard. As long as you take your time, do a bit of research, and you've got the right equipment, you can normally get a really good finish quite easily. This book is a great recommendation. It's by Craig Thibodeau, and it really is like the Bible of veneering. You can check out his YouTube channel if you want to just get really insecure about your own woodworking. The stuff this guy does is crazy. I think he's also got a website as well, which is CT Fine Furniture, but worth checking out. Joining veneers together is pretty straightforward. As long as you start off with a good clean straight edge, you just use some tape, bring the two pieces together, and then you can move on to cutting it to size. It often depends on the project, but in this example I bring the workpiece over to the veneer. I then use a veneer saw and the side of the workpiece as a guide to cut along the length of the grain. I then use a pencil to mark the top and the bottom line, remove the workpiece, get a good straight edge and a good sharp knife, and then that's how I take off the waste material on each end. If you live in the UK like me and you enjoy woodwork, you soon realise that the cost of hardwood means you need to remortgage your house if you want to just build a set of chest of drawers. And this is the reason that I really like using veneers. You can mix and match with a combination of veneers and hardwood to produce some really nice furniture that doesn't break the bank. You can also produce some really funky effects that you just can't do with hardwood. After a quick inspection by the foreman, probably looking for evidence of new tool purchases, it was time to put some iron-on edging on a few of the pieces and then use a domino to set the position for the shelf. I applied some hardwood edging to the front of each of the shelves, and then it was time to glue up this first section. Right, well that seemed to go to plan. Next it was time to focus on the hardwood face frame and cutting a few bits up for the drawer fronts. The strategy for this project was based on me using up lots of materials in my workshop, and that includes some walnut that I had lying around. But because of that, a lot of these cuts of walnut are not the ideal grain orientation for this type of furniture. So in an ideal world, you'd want to use quarter sawn stock for face frames. This is to ensure that you get straight grain on at least 3 of the faces. But you know, I had what I had, so we'll make the best of it. To create the face frame, first I cut the top rail square to each side. After marking the direction of the mitre on each side, I then walk over to the mitre saw and just cut it roughly to 45 degrees. I then put the side pieces resting in position, put this first piece back on top and then use a pencil just to mark the line. Use the crosscut sled to sneak up on this line, and then that should give us the perfect mitre. For fixing face frames like this onto a piece of furniture, I like nothing more than a nice cup of tea and a biscuit. Finally, before fixing any of this into place, I go over to the router table and use a chamfer bit to cut a nice sort of profile onto the inside of the face frame. Next, it's time to get on with veneering the outside of these side tables. but I was going to try something a little bit different for this. I've seen a few videos on YouTube about veneering with contact adhesive, and to be honest I was just intrigued to see how well it would work. The idea is that you apply this adhesive to both surfaces, let it dry for 5 to 10 minutes, and then you can bring them back together and everything should work. Now the challenge here is that once these surfaces touch each other, there's no getting them apart, and we had the striped pattern running through the veneer, so it was really important that I got everything lined up correctly. The way I approached this was to use some wax paper, just leaving a very fine edge on the top corner where the veneer will meet the next veneer. With the use of some very carefully marked pencil lines, it all kind of went pretty well really. When you're working with veneers, it's really important to make sure that all your tools are very sharp. You really don't want to get to this stage in a project and then rip out a big chunk of your veneer that could have been solved by just spending an extra 2 minutes sharpening. I've got to be honest, this is my favourite part of veneering. I love the challenge of trying to get seamless, invisible lines on all the joints. So I start off by fine-tuning all the edges with a block plane, and then I use sanding paper just to feather those joints right down, paying careful attention to the grain direction, and in particular when you get to corners you've got to be pretty careful. Right, next time for the drawers and some sexy hand-cut joinery. So before you do any hand-cut joinery, you're really going to want some nice square stock and some really sharp tools. On a lot of my chisels I tend to go for 2 bevels at 25 and 30 degrees. I use diamond plates, and a good little tip is I always use WD-40 as the lubricant because it saves the plates from rusting and it's dirt cheap. And then I move over to the strop. If you keep your chisels nice and sharp, to be honest I don't use the diamond plates that often. I just go back to the strop to touch up the edges after I've used them, and this seems to keep them really sharp for long periods of time. So to start with, we just use a marking gauge to establish how far into the drawer face we want the tails to sit. You then transfer that depth onto all the edges of the tails board. I then just pick a measurement that kind of looks good to my eye for marking the outside edge of each of the tails. I then use a set of dividers to work out the inside edge. So the idea here is you start off on one line and you spin it across, and by the time you get to the other line, the distance that you overshoot that line is going to be the width of your central pin. Once you're happy with your spacing, you then just start off on each line and then put a little pin mark in the middle of the board where you want your line to be. Grab a square and then mark all these lines up. Now in terms of the angled lines for the tails, I'm a 1 in 8 kind of guy. So I recommend getting a little jig. They're really easy to use. You just pop it on top of your straight line and draw down till you get to the knife line. Okay, so now it's time to cut this all out. Okay, so first of all, apologies for a lot of camera shaking during this segment. I start off by making a small cut just on the waist side of the line. Once I'm happy with that, I then step back, make sure everything's lined up, and then saw all the way through. It's really important on these sort of joints that you just practice and get really good at sawing straight. It's actually more important to be straight and square than it is to be really close to the line. I then cut off the waste material on the shoulder of the tails board, but again I'm not trying to get ultra close to the line because I can tidy these up with a chisel. Next, it's time to remove the waste between the two tails. So for that, I just grab a coping saw and work from one side to the other until I get nice and close to the bottom knife line. Then it's time to flip the board over and start removing the rest of the waste. So for this, I like to roll the chisel into the corners just to break the fibres first, and then you just start paring your way back to the knife line. You only want to go down just over halfway. You then flip the board over and then begin the whole process again. The other thing I do at this stage is for the final cut right into the knife line, I like to do a couple of light taps with the chisel square, and then I actually turn it slightly in towards the cut. This creates a little bit of an angle, so it just helps the joint seat better. Now, convention dictates that you should really sit square on to the chisels so that you can actually see visually if the chisel is straight or not. I've got to be honest, I'm just comfortable this way and I've always done it like this, and I've made enough bad joints now to know when the chisel's straight or not. Next, you just pop the tails board back in the vise and then start cleaning up the inside edges. Then lastly, you just want to fine tune the shoulders, and again clean up the inside edge, just gives it a better chance of seating first time. Next up, the pins. So you simply rest your tails board on top of the pin board. You then mark out with a knife the area that you want to cut away, and then with something like walnut, I like to actually just go over the knife lines with a mechanical pencil, just because it's not that easy to see. You then continue these lines at 90 degrees down the inside face of the drawer front. To establish the stop point for these marks, I go over to the tails board, use a marking gauge, and then transfer that back across, and this is basically going to be the depth of the pins. Right, time to remove the waste. So I like to make a saw mark on the top edge and the front edge, but I'm just trying to get nowhere near those lines. I'm trying to create a kind of inside edge to follow, which is a good 2 or 3 millimeters away from my finish edge. I then just join these marks up with chisel lines, and then this gives me a good area to clean out. The key bit of this is really just not going anywhere near those finish points. It's just a process to get rid of the bulk of the waste. So to remove the waste, you start off by doing a couple of firm hits on the waistline at the back of the face. You then stick it in the vise and start tapping away to remove a few chunks at a time. This whole thing is actually starting to sound really complicated, but trust me, it's pretty easy. It's just a bit of practice. Once you've removed the waste, it's time just to start paring back to your finish lines. Now the thing with a blind dovetail is there's only one face that actually matters, and that's the outside end grain face. You can make an absolute hash of the rest of this joint, and as long as that face looks good, nobody will ever know. Lastly, I just take off the back edges of the tails. This again just gives it a good chance of seating first time, and then it's time to offer it up to see how it fits. You can usually get a feel if these are going to go in first time, but don't hammer away like a maniac trying to get it to fit. Just play about with it, but I was pretty happy with this, that it was going to fit first time and it was going to be nice and tight. For the back of the drawer, I decided to go with the mighty screw, but I did actually decide to cut some plugs out of some maple just to make it look a little bit tidier. Then it was time for a good old-fashioned glue up. Now this might seem like a strange choice for how to fit the bottom of the drawers, but hear me out. I will do almost anything not to have to go to the shop when I'm in the middle of building something, and the only thing I had in my workshop that would be suitable for drawer bottoms was this pre-veneered 18mm MDF. So normally I would just cut a little groove on the inside components of the drawer and then slide the drawer bottom in, so it'd be nice and neat. But if I did that with an 18mm panel on a drawer that's already quite shallow, it would have meant that the drawer would just look silly. There would be no room to put anything in there. So I needed to fix this right at the bottom, and pocket holes just seemed like the quickest and easiest way. But I did put some maple plugs in there just so it didn't look too horrendous. To fix these drawers, I just made up some simple drawer runners out of some offcuts of walnut, lined up all my spacing, and then just screwed it all in. So coming from Somerset, I'm a simple kind of guy, and I tend to always use the same finish on hardwood projects. I like a water-based varnish. I apply it with a sprayer. I really like these Apollo sprayers. You don't see that many of them in the UK, but I think they're quite big in the US. It's a 3-stage turbine, so it gives you a lot of power and you can get a nice fine finish with it. After it's dry, I like to rub it all down with 400 grit wet and dry sandpaper, and then I think we can call this one done. I was really happy with how these came out. I like the book matched walnuts on the outside of the side tables with the smoked eucalyptus going through the middle, and I think the proportions all seem to work quite nicely. And now I finally had somewhere to stick that magazine. Come on, really?